Hello all, welcome to week 3. This week I've split the content into 2 short lectures. So the first lecture today is on practice with culturally diverse groups. There'll be another lecture on working respectfully with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So firstly, for this first component of this week's topic, your required reading is chapter 13 on cross-cultural practice. There's also chapter 12, which talks about working with refugees and asylum seekers. It's a really important chapter to read. Not compulsory set reading, sorry, I'm flicking through slides here, but nonetheless really important for a really good understanding of this topic. I know from the introductions on the forum that we've got a couple of students who are actually engaged in this field of practice, so I would love for this week if you could get onto the forum and share some of your knowledge and experiences with your peers who may not have a lot of knowledge in working cross-culturally. And in particular, if you are from a culturally diverse group or non-English speaking background yourself, please jump on the forum and share your experiences and your knowledge, and I think it will add to a really nice, rich learning opportunity this week. So firstly, a little bit on that terminology. We hear a lot of terms thrown around, and we have done over many decades now and throughout history heard lots of different terms. So some of the more common terms that you might hear when speaking about people who are culturally and linguistically diverse are of course called your cultural and linguistic diverse people. A non-English speaking background, you might hear the terms immigrants or ethnics or newcomers or new Australian or boat person or refugee. A lot of these terms are really thrown around in our media in this country, so they sort of make their way into society's minds and become really commonplace. But obviously, to all of us, they have inherent ideas linked to them and ways of thinking, and not all of them are positive terms, of course. Some of them are actually quite hurtful in some instances. So a little bit today on Australia's immigration patterns. I think it's really important to be able to think about the historical context in terms of where we are at the moment as a country. So, of course, Australia was colonised largely by immigrants from Britain and Ireland. We talk a lot more about our history of colonisation in the second lecture for this week, so more on that later. But it was a terrible time where we found that our Indigenous people of our country were dispossessed. They were exploited and they were ignored. So that's basically one of the key parts of our history that underpins culturally diverse groups within our country at the moment. Following this, there were continued waves of immigration into the country, in particular post-World War II, and variations in broad policy throughout these eras. So from the White Australia policy to policies of multiculturalism and other subsequent policies, which I'll cover a little in this lecture, but there's also a lot of content within your modules for this week. So broadly, there have been phases within the migration policy for this country. From 1947 to 64, we saw a policy of assimilation, and the assimilation policy was basically the idea of you need to assimilate, you need to become the same as us to fit into this country. And I'm sure some of you who lived through this era or had your parents or grandparents lived through this era would have some idea of what it was like and what that meant for people who were culturally and linguistically diverse, or people who weren't, and what was happening at this time. There's a plethora of resources on this as well that you can find, and if you are interested, please jump onto the forums. From 64 to 72, we saw more thought towards integration, trying to integrate those who were from different backgrounds into the community. 72 to 75, the idea of ethnic pluralism. From 75 onwards, we started to see phases of multiculturalism. So I've got them down here as stage 1 and stage 2 from about 75 to 88, and what that meant. I've got a little bit on the slides coming up about what multiculturalism looks like from one perspective, of course. And I think that's why this week in particular, it's really important that we get some engagement on the forums about what multiculturalism looks like for you, and what it means. For each of us, it's going to be completely different, of course. Within the literature and within the policy, between 88 and 93, we're really looking at post-multiculturalism. So what does that look like? And 93 to the current, McMahon states, is the neo-cosmopolitanism. What's that and what's that all about? More on that later, and of course on the forums. Please join in and share your ideas of what it looks like now and what your thoughts are on this. So multiculturalism, it's a term that we've all probably heard before, that we all have different ideas about. When it boils down to it, basically, I think, most importantly, it's a recognition and a valuing of cultural diversity. It's not saying that one culture is better than another or one is superior to the other. It's an understanding that all cultural identities and cultures have inherent strengths, and an appreciation for different cultures. A freedom to express and share cultural values whilst abiding by mutual civic obligations. I think that's a really important comment too, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. There are principles that underpin multiculturalism. So some of these principles, as I've detailed on this slide, are responsibilities for all. So a duty to support civic structures and principles of Australian society. So that idea is basically in that within the society we are bound by the laws of Australia and by certain things. And please, again, on the forum, share any of your ideas and thoughts around this. I'm not here to sort of dictate my knowledge bases or share my thoughts and ideas on this. I'd really like to have a great, generous discussion about these things. Ideas of respect for each person. I think that fits really well with social work and welfare ideologies as well. And people's right to express their culture, and reciprocal right for others to do the same. Fairness to each people. So fairness is really one of those values that underpins multiculturalism as well as our fields of practice, that all people are entitled to equality and of treatment and opportunity and social equity as well, and benefits for all. So diversity brings dividends for all, those be your social, cultural and economic. So a little bit more about Australia's immigration patterns. At present, there's 3 immigration programs. So if you were to immigrate to Australia at this point, which some of you would have in recent years, and I know from the introductions there's some of you who have shared this with the group, and that's wonderful. I'd love to hear your insights on this as well. I'm not myself an immigrant to the country, so by no means am an expert on this topic or have any sort of personal experience or insight. And I think those experiences and knowledges are really invaluable when we're talking about these sort of things. So we do have 3 programs. So an economic program based on skills and money, which I think a lot of us would be really aware of. These programs, family reunion, so if you've got family or you're related to an Australian citizen, as well as humanitarian. So I think sometimes a humanitarian immigration program gets sort of the most attention in the wide media and in society, and a lot of talk around it and what it means and what constitutes humanitarian reasons for immigration. But I'm not here in this lecture today to have those debates, and we all have our different opinions and there's research surrounding this. But please, if you do feel strongly or you want to share, do so. So asylum seekers are those who fled their country because of a persecution or a fear of persecution. They've come directly to Australia and they're seeking refugee status here. I'm just looking down at my notes here. In 92, we had policy brought in which dictated mandatory detention for unauthorised arrivals. So what is mandatory detention? As we are probably all aware from, again, the mainstream media and probably our work in the field and potentially our own or those that we know and love experiences, this country does have mandatory detention. As of 31st of May this year, there were 1,400 people in immigration detention facilities. I guess a positive thing is that this has decreased a lot in recent years, which I think is quite a positive. When this subject was taught back in 2013, I think that number was almost triple, if not more. So we have seen a decrease. Still way too many in my mind, but again, not into the personal convictions here. So at present, actually almost 13% of those in mandatory detention are from New Zealand. About 9% are from Malaysia, 8% from Vietnam, and 7% from Iran, and 6.5% from Sri Lanka. So I just grabbed those stats quickly off the Department of Immigration and Border Protection website, which I know you all reviewed within your learning modules. And I found those stats quite interesting, a little surprising, I guess. And I think that we all have ideas of mandatory detention, which are sometimes predisposed through what we hear and what's said about mandatory detention. But when we look a little bit beyond the surface level of these discussions, we begin to discover that there's actually quite a diverse and interesting range of nationalities represented in those who are kept in detention in our country. So some practice issues for social work. I think there's a lot of these are clearly evident, the role that we need to play as social workers and welfare workers in this sector. And I know, as I said, many of you are involved in the sector currently. So we need to be looking at an evolution of social work in a monocultural context. So that's going back to some of the things we spoke about in the first couple of weeks. A need for cultural sensitivity and anti-racist practice. I'll look at that a little bit in the coming slides as well. So what is cultural sensitivity and ethnic sensitivity? The words are bandied about a lot in practice, and it's not an easy thing to define or even to understand. And I think it's one of those things that takes a lot of critical self-reflection and reflection on and in practice. But at a very base elemental level, it aims to reduce misunderstandings, miscommunication and bias in the social work contact with a client. And your anti-racist, anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory practice focuses on historic and structural disadvantage, especially for those regarding gender, race, class and ethnic identity. So cultural sensitivity models. We've got an ethno-specific model. And rather than hear me sort of read through the slides, which I understand can be quite tiresome, I'll let you just read through this at your leisure. And again, if anything you need to ask for further clarification, please do so in the forums. A psychological/interpersonal approach. Understanding that culture is seen as understanding another's feelings, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours, as well as being reflective of our own. So similar to what I spoke about in the first lecture, I think it was, we really need to be reflecting on where we come from and who we are as a practitioner as well. And these models really emphasise empathy and cultural awareness. Linguistic and communication approach, a focus on what is said and how is it said. It examines dynamics of cross-cultural interactions. It also sensitizes social workers to communicating effectively with clients. Again, we need to reflect on the way in which we communicate and our behaviours, and those small things, our interpersonal communication, our body language, our eye contact and those sort of things. Anti-racist models of practice, attempt to challenge the oppressive practices and structures that maintain the dominant group's position in society. For me, this is a really exciting one. As a social worker, I'm a strong advocate for social justice and human rights, and I think these models of practice really advocate for that outlook and that outcome for the way in which we work. I've compressed all of this onto one slide, so the font's a little bit small, but I think it's important to get a really good overview of what these models of practice look like as a whole. Of course, anti-oppressive practice is one of those key values within the ASW Code of Ethics that you read in the first week and will be referencing in your first assignment. So becoming familiar with that's really helpful as well. Again, ethical issues, a nice little segue there. Our ongoing main issue, I think, ethically as social workers and workers within welfare is mandatory detention. On many, many levels, it's, of course, a violation of many things, but human rights predominantly. And I think as social workers and welfare workers, this is a real ethical issue for us. The power differential between social work and the client group. So inherently, as a worker within the field, you hold a certain power. And the idea that that power may be exasperated when you're working with a client who is from a non-English speaking background or a group that is perhaps not the dominant group in society. So being really aware of that and the ethical issues that pertains to as well. The monocultural approach to service provision. So I guess a key example of this is the fact that within our field, and particularly, I mean, I've done a lot of rural social work practice, and I find that a lot of the service provision at times is quite monocultural in the approach. A lot of your resources and your programs are not only written by white people, but they're in English and they're delivered in a way that may be culturally inappropriate for other cultures. So we need to really think about the way we work in what is at times quite a monocultural type setting, as well as a lack of cultural sensitivity and reflection on one's ethnicity. So I think that's an issue for social workers and welfare workers in that we reflect on others' culture and we reflect on how best to practice in terms of working with their culture. However, we often negate looking at our own ethnicity and reflecting on who we are as a practitioner and what that means for our practice and our practice with that client. So I guess to end on, I'd really encourage you to think about that. I think we traditionally some students have said, oh, well, I don't have an ethnicity. I'm not sure what that means. And as a developing and learning social work student or social welfare, it's something that we really need to figure out. In order to help others, we really need to have a really good knowledge of ourselves and who we are and what we bring to the role. So thank you, and I'll just flick over to my references, not many this week, but again, that website, if you didn't get a chance to look at it in the first week, some really interesting statistics that could really probably potentially challenge some things that you think about or know about border protection and immigration in this country. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you all soon as well in a second lecture for this week. I promise not to inundate you with 2 lectures every week. However, this week I thought it was really important to have the 2 separate lectures as they were quite distinct topics with obviously similar crossover, but important to have a lecture in their own right. So I'll speak to you all soon. Thank you.